Thanks so much for being with us tonight. My name's Colleen Curlin. I lead the programming for The Battery, and I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion about the book Gold Diggers by Sanjena Sathian. We are joined by her in conversation about this novel. It's her debut novel. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it or see what we posted about it, I personally just finished it and loved it. It is a really wonderful and moving story about immigrant identity, community, and the underside of our ambition. It takes place between Georgia and San Francisco, so it's very fitting. It's a must read for everyone who's living in the Bay Area. It was named Best Book of April by Bustle, PopSugar, Entertainment Weekly, Good Morning America, and CNN. And it's also being optioned for a television series with Mindy Kaling's production company. So we are joined also by Jessica Kung Dreyfus, who is one of the co-chairs of the Battery's AAPI Society. We recently launched the society with the help of Jessica, Helena, and Joyce, who are all members of the Battery, to focus on the issues of the AAPI community and how we can band together. I know Jessica will share a little bit more about that, but it's been really great working with her on building this community within the Battery. Tonight's going to be a really casual conversation, so if you feel comfortable, turn your camera on and you can take yourself off mute and join us in conversation. Sanjena is going to share a little bit about the book and her own experience writing it. And if you've had a chance to read it, we'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jessica to kick things off.
Thanks, Colleen and Sanjena, for joining us in this conversation. So a little bit of background about how this event came together and the AAPI. And it really, for us, the energy around this conversation started with the Atlanta massacre of the Asian American women. And Sanjena actually, she actually published an op-ed in the LA Times around that. But we reconnected around that time. And I was really reaching out to a lot of my Asian women friends and community. And the issue really came up around Asian American women voices. And sort of organically, Joyce had also contacted the Battery, and then Helena came in, and the society really formed organically around our need to talk to each other about just what it was like to be a woman of Asian American descent, or what that even was. And it was almost like I never really had any urgency to really look into that until April. And then somehow it all kind of came together. And this conversation also came in with the founding of the society. I was like, oh my God, my friend is coming out with this book, and I hadn't read it yet. I was just super excited that, like, as this Asian American consciousness and voice was arising, this book was also coming out. And I had met Sanjena like many years, I don't even know how many years ago, like 5, 7?
Probably 2014.
Yes.
Like maybe 2013. Right
Like
when I moved out there.
Stefan and I had just started teaching yoga at Yoga Tree. So 2013 is when we started. Yes! In San Francisco. And you started coming to class. And we met at Yoga Tree in San Francisco. Like most people meet in San Francisco. So, yeah.
And it was the best yoga class I have ever attended, and I want to be back under your instruction soon. Yeah, it was so attentive. So yeah, very memorable.
Thank you. Well, we're talking about. I'm gonna have to bring up the yogic themes in your book because there's just a ton of them, and that's one of the things that's fascinating to me about it. And so I guess my first question or just to share, like, when I was able to get a copy of it, like my first reaction as I was reading it was like, OMG, I can't believe she's doing this. Like, and that she's pulling it off with like the sheer brilliance of how you're able to bring all these different influences together to create what felt like, and what so many people are excited about, is not just your voice, but the voice, the arising of the voice that you're representing as well. And so maybe if you just want to how does that feel, like to come into your voice and to feel that you're also bringing all these voices along with you? Because I feel like I'm in that field with you right now.
Mm, that's so nice of you to say that. Yeah, I mean, it takes a long time to figure out what you sound like, right? Like as a writer, but also as a human. And I wrote a lot and threw a lot away over the course of like the last 8 years. I was working on like a very, very different project when we first met that didn't sound like me. And it was actually because I was trying too hard to sort of speak to a collective. Like I was trying really hard to write like the great Indian American novel, and it wasn't working. And so in a lot of ways I had to get more private about it and read a lot and write a lot that wasn't collective at all. And I think that's kind of one of the interesting like core lessons about art for me is like often by if you want to say something universal, you have to say something extremely particular first. So it's been really nice to hear that other people feel carried along by some component of the book if they feel represented or they recognize something of themselves. But a lot of that is sort of I feel happy that that is happening. But if I had started with that intention, it would have gone really badly. Like you have to just commit to making something that's a little smaller than maybe what you started out wanting to make. Like I feel like there's this like whittling away of ego that has to happen when you're starting out writing. And the book, of course, is interested in collective experiences. Like it's interested in what it felt like to be Indian American, but it's such a specific Indian American experience. Like I grew up in suburbia, and the book is about suburbia, but I have friends on this call who grew up in like small town Iowa and like in Europe, and like they're Indian American and I don't speak for them, right? It's a very specific and narrow experience in that sense.
I love that you said that. The, I wrote down whittling away of ego. Can you say more? Like, how does your writing? Because you can also aggrandize the ego, right? So writing can be about you, but then how do you write about you without it being about you?
Oh, I think it's both. I feel like every writer I know is just like has wild swings between extreme arrogance and like total humility. Like one thing that I really value about this work is that it does force you to constantly ask yourself if you're correct about the world, and often to consider the idea that you might not be. Like if you're writing about your world, sometimes you're writing about yourself, sometimes you're drawing on your own experience, but other times you're writing about people you knew, and you have to sort of head hop and imagine what it was like to be them. And imagining what it was like to be them means considering yourself in a new light. And so I think that's part of the ego stuff. Do you like George Saunders, Jessica?
I'm not familiar with George Saunders.
So George Saunders is a fiction writer who is a practicing Tibetan Buddhist,
Oh,
and
yes. Okay, I know who you're
yeah,
talking about.
he wrote Lincoln in the Bardo.
Yeah.
And he talks about character in this way, like it's a heavy like craft writer nerd conversation that I think actually really relates to what I can tell is like the practice of Tonglen, but he doesn't call it that. But you know, that's for people unfamiliar, that's the Tibetan Buddhist compassion meditation. And he talks about this idea that when you're kind of looking at a character you're writing, a lot of what you have to do is try to like imagine your own suffering into them, and then also imagine what it's this dance between how they see you, how you see them, where you extend empathy and where you extend anger to, and where they extend anger to you. Like it is about this sort of taking yourself outside yourself in order to understand yourself better. And so I love thinking about writers like George Saunders who actually do see writing as a way to be a better person. I don't really think it makes me a fundamentally better person at all. I think it's still really selfish. I think it has a lot to do with my ego, but I think there are components of it that are that whittling, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So then we get to the intentionality, like, why do you write?
Um,
Why do you laugh?
it's so hard to know why we do anything. I mean, there's this super pretentious Bukowski quote that I think about a lot because it's really annoying, but it kind of is my only answer. He wrote that I just I assume that's a baby thing. Um, uh, he wrote that you should only be a writer if doing anything else would drive you to suicide or murder. And that's, as I say, pretentious, but it really was kind of the only thing I could do. I was a journalist. I was okay at it. I wasn't great. I didn't like it that much. I was always writing fiction on the side. I think I like that. I like that you get to sort of be both loving and also really grouchy. Like that's like it suits my personality to be kind of both critical of the world and also be very hopeful about what it could look like there's this particular convergence of romanticism and cynicism that like only a fiction writer is allowed to have. So I think it's kind of constitutionally what I was supposed to be doing.
I mean, it just takes so much focus to, before you're 30, write what you've written. I mean, I recognize that as like a huge, just like, you really cannot have been distracted by anything else since like the day you were born.
Or you have to be distracted by just the right thing.
Exactly, right?
Because I think I was distracted plenty. But I was probably like trying to, I think I spent a lot of time trying to get something out of a distraction. So I would be like, I'll go do this thing that's bad for me because it'll be material. But it's great for like generating life experience. And now I feel like I've like lived a little more than I intended to in my 20s. And now I really do just want to be silent and be alone and be away from stuff to write, which is what I did when I wrote this. I felt like I had been like living on overdrive, sort of intentionally distracting myself with the world. And then I went to graduate school and sat in the middle of the cornfields in Iowa and got to write this. So these sort of like intense swings between like manic life experience and then intense focus.
So I definitely felt that energy when I was reading the book. There was that like, I wouldn't call it manic energy, and I wouldn't even call it page turning energy, but it's almost like the speed at which you would toggle between seemingly disparate influences. And so like when I spoke to you yesterday, I was like, I couldn't believe, like, among the many like impossible bridges that are completely coherent in your story, is like I never thought I would be reading Zadie Smith and David Gordon White like through the same thing. So just a little bit of background, like Sanjena and I have lots of interesting overlaps, including like the strange literature we read. So she's, a lot of the books that she researched on the alchemical background of India is just what I studied as a yoga teacher, but in their original texts as well. And so I could tell, when just opening the first few books, I could tell which books she had read to get that information. I was like, oh, Alchemical Body. Like she must have read Alchemical Body. And I could also tell, because there's the traditions that you come from, but then there's also what we can call, what I could read through your book was the hermeneutics, that how you've interpreted the research that you came through. And what was really interesting to me was that because I've studied yoga traditions, alchemy, tantra, through the source texts, which are Sanskrit, and also read the white colonial commentary on it. They're very different, right? One are these like stories of the saints that share these alchemical processes, and another is an anthropological view that looks at it like, isn't this curious? And I could actually feel in your writing that, isn't it curious? like the curiosity of the alchemy that almost is very different from, that's the fiction, which is different from the person that, almost from the practice of it. There's a mythology around it, and that energy is what I picked up through your writing. And I just found that really fascinating that it came through your Indian heritage, came through a white scholar and that tradition, and then you brought it back into your lived experience. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the problems with doing research as like an amateur, because I'm never a scholar, right? So I had the same problem when I was doing research into, there are basically like two buckets of research that I did, one into alchemical traditions and the other into like history, particularly the history of the gold rush. And you just like, as someone who isn't ever going to be an expert in any of these areas, you just feel, I think, all the time the limitations on relying that come from relying on other people to do the original scholarship. And I got very, very nervous when I started dating a historian who's like, my character is a 19th century economic historian in the second half. And I am now dating a 19th century economic historian. And I was like, I just got very paranoid when he started reading the book, because I was like, it hadn't come out yet. I gave him an advanced copy and I was like, he's going to get to the second half and tell me that everything is wrong. He's going to tell me like, I don't understand how the economy works. I don't understand how history works. And in the end, he's been very kind. But I think I have like a kind of like intense awareness of all the ways in which you are a generalist when you're a novelist, right? You pick and you choose, and you're not ever going to get that close to the real thing. But your defense is just, well, these characters don't get that close. So one thing that I think is interesting is, there's one character in the book who would really know everything that you studied, and he's not really on the page. So that knowledge is somewhere in the fringes. But that same thing happens with sort of the body of history research that's in the book. Like there's someone who possesses the full knowledge, but that person's never on the page. So I get to have just the right amount of plausible deniability to keep the reality of the history or the alchemical traditions. There's always like 1 degree of removal, which I think is just a fiction writer's tactic.
But what I find so fascinating is that when I read the history, it's dead, but your book is alive. Right? It's like, it's the first time I felt those yogic traditions like alive, like in suburbia. Like you're like, oh, it's happening. And like I'm reading it in a book with Stefan, and I told you like the part where he messes up the mantra. I'm like, oh shit. And like I actually put the book down and I was like, Stefan's like, what's wrong? And I was like, something, I'm like, honey, something bad's gonna happen. Like, it's like I can't watch it. I like know that he fucked up the mantra and it's like gonna be bad. And it's like, I don't get those like stomach churning things when I'm reading, yogic texts or history books. Because it's like you already at page 30, you're invested in these characters and you're like, oh no, I don't even want to know what's gonna happen, but I have to because I'm interviewing her, so I have to finish this book.
Sorry to put you through that.
I think if I didn't have to talk to you, I might have just never been able to go through it. No, I'm like that. Like I can't even watch PG movies.
It's too close to home. I get it.
Yeah. So I have a bunch of questions. I think I'd like to open it up if any of you guys have any questions. But first, my other question was around this idea of genius. Like I was reading some reviews and they're like, this book is genius. And like this idea, like, and when I'm working with Make Conscious and when we talk about creativity and this recontextualizing of what genius is, from this egoic, like, I'm a genius, to we're stewarding genius, right, through our influences. So like, how do you, when you read a review that says this is a genius book, and like when you're, yeah, like what do you feel? Like, I'm a genius, or like, what's my relationship with genius? Or if you've heard that talk by Elizabeth Gilbert where she talks about how we're stewards of genius.
Mm. That's a cool phrase. I like that phrase. I mean, honestly, it's like, it's kind of messed me up, being in public. It's weird. This is a thing that I wrote that was a Word document for a really long time. And when I put it into the world, I obviously had hopes that people would like it, and all kinds of like grandiose hopes and dreams. But in order to protect yourself, you can't put that at the forefront of your mind. And so to go from this being like what actually was sort of like a private thing to existing in public, it's just like very jarring. And so it doesn't feel like anyone's writing about me when they say nice things. It's really cool to see, but it feels like it's about something that is like not a part of me anymore. It's very disembodied. And so like, I also have sort of taken myself away from it. Like, I was really on social media for the first 3 weeks after the book came out, and that just really ran me ragged. And so basically for the last month and a half, I have just been occupied with things that have nothing to do with this book. And I do these events, and these events are sort of discreet. And that's been really important because it means that like all of that cool, exciting thing, like that fade, it's so trite. Like, everything I'm going to say is so trite, but like it fades. The rush is there when you read a nice thing or when you feel like something is succeeding, but it's immediately followed by desire for more. And like, if someone liked this book, will they like the next book? Everything they like about this book, isn't that just proof that like, if I don't do that again, the next book will be a flop? It's just so unhealthy. And it's something that I know a lot of writers experience when they start reading reviews. So yeah, maybe stewards of genius sounds like a healthier way to think about things that maybe I will arrive at in a few years. But right now I'm in this like extremely sort of like self-preservational mode around work, because I am trying to write again, and I couldn't for the last couple of months, because we talked about this yesterday too, right? Like the difference between creation and promotion, like they're different things. And you said it really neatly, like the thing that say what you said yesterday. You said something about the thing that causes you to make is also say what you said yesterday.
Oh yeah, well it's just karma. So when the seed produces the result, the seed dies. The very thing that created it is destroyed by its final production, and you got to start over.
Yeah.
It's one of the fundamental yogic teachings, karma. So karma is like a seed. So the seed of the book or the seed of your life, when that seed opens, it's already died too. And so by the time it's a fruit, that's gone. I said it better yesterday. Well, the thing that creates it also kills it.
Yeah, I think that's what it is. So yeah, it exists apart from me now. I hope people like it. I'm gonna write some new stuff. I hope people like that one day too.
But I love how you said that it's disembodied. It's like, it's not even that it's disembodied, it's that when it's born, it was a toddler, but now it's a teenager. And it's got legs of its own, it's got its own friends. You can go, it's almost in college now. You can go do another thing.
Yeah, I don't know where on the stage of development it is. Maybe I just dropped it off at school. I don't really understand children, so other people who have children and tend to them will be able to understand this better than I can.
Well, considering that you're going to be going through the pitching process, it's going to feel like your kid just got a bunch of friends that feel like a burden. Feel like they're at your house and you're like, wait, these are not my kid, but why am I responsible for them?
Yeah, maybe that. Jessica's referring to, we're gonna start pitching the show, the book as an adaptation soon. I've started working with someone who's going to be the showrunner, and yeah, we just started talking about how the world is going to change, how the plot is going to change, what parts are going to stay stable, what parts are going to shift, and that was actually really cool. It's a way of breathing new life into a thing that feels like it's apart from me. So I'm like kind of developing a new relationship to it. And it's also helpful that like I have distance now too, because when we're talking about changing a plot point, I'm like, oh yeah, sure. Like I have no ego attachment to a lot of the choices that I made originally. There are some things that have to stay stable, but there are a lot of things that can shift. And yeah, so that's its own kind of weird growth arc.
It's an animal.
Yeah.
And just to share something, now that I'm in LA, but both my current husband, my husband, and my ex boyfriend are both LA people. Like I met Stefan when he was an editor at The Bachelor, and my previous college boyfriend at Yale, he ended up being a screenwriter. And when Stefan and I would hang out with him and his girlfriend, we asked him about one of his projects, like what is it like to pitch. I think he had just I think he had just released Godzilla. That was like his first big movie, and he was like, "Okay, I think this will be helpful, Sanjena." He was like, "In order for it to get accepted, you need to put everything, all of you, into the pitch and more. It's like you have to put everything, or else it's not gonna fly. Like whatever you put into the book, it's like more for the movie. Yeah, or else it's not gonna be picked up. But then you have to completely release all attachment, or else you will just drop out of the film industry because it gets destroyed. Like everyone starts working on it. It's like if you didn't put all of you into it, you wouldn't get it. But then once you got it, you have to then completely release all attachment, or else you'll be devastated by the consequences."
Yeah.
And I was like,
Wow.
that's helpful.
Yeah, that's one of the things about it being a collective process, film and TV. Like it can't, like the initial idea has to fully belong to one person, and then it can never belong to you again.
That's
Like a
exactly
hard,
right.
yeah, that's a hard thing to come to terms with. But I don't know. I'm trying to be, I am like going to be heavily involved in the adaptation, but I'm trying to, play well with others. I think it'll be fun. I think it's a good exercise more than anything. I think it's a good exercise for anyone artistic or creative to try and like play in someone else's sandbox. And like that is the thing that I've always sort of romantically thought was interesting about film and television from the outside. Like I know it is really difficult when you go out to LA and you want to make your own stuff, and you have to start writing spec scripts in someone else's voice. You have to like write for someone else's show in order to prove that you can do your own thing. Um, but in a way, that's what journalism is like. You are using someone else's voice and tone to tell a couple of specific stories. And I think there's something really powerful about using someone else's narrative engine to try and explore what you want to explore. Like it's a really good exercise. It's really productive. It teaches you a lot about what belongs to you and what you can steal. So I'm actually kind of excited about that. Like art requires constraints sometimes, and like putting in some artificial constraints can actually make something really powerful within those constraints. But this is all romantic and from the outside because I haven't done it yet.
I'm glad you used the word steal, because your book is all about stealing. And a lot of my art teachers used to say, like, good artists borrow, great artists steal. And there, say more, because I feel like there's a lot of stealing, both the plot, but also like in terms of how you create your own voice. It's like, when does the way you brought all those influences, but they're stolen.
Totally stolen. The thing I often tell my students is like the asterisk to that kind of common saying, good artists borrow, great artists steal, like really you have to steal from a lot of different places. Otherwise it really becomes obvious that you're writing, like in grad school, people would say like, oh, so-and-so just writes budget Marquez, or they write budget Kafka. Like you never want someone to be able to say that you're doing like budget Zadie Smith, right? Like that's a bad look. And it more than anything, it just sort of indicates like if there was someone else out there in the world who already had the tools to make what you're making, like why are you making it? Why are you reiterating something that already exists? And so what the cool thing about stealing is that if you steal from enough places, people don't really notice and they just think it's like really original. When in fact it's a Frankensteinian monster stitched together from your many influences. So for me, like it's just come from having like a really, really wide reading diet, which I did by necessity because there was not like a single canon that accounted for like my life experience or my worldview. Like I've had to go down really kind of funky rabbit holes for a few years, like get really into like ghost stories across cultures for 1 year, and then get really into like neuroscience for like a semester in college, but then also combine that stuff with like a lot of different literary influences. So like half magic realism, half social realism, and putting those things in conversation, it makes for something new, even though they're really, really disparate. But I really just think people don't read widely enough, or people don't think from like as many different, people just don't look wide enough for inspiration for what they want to do, which is why everything kind of looks the same. And if we all just had this attitude that over there in someone else's world or aesthetic or discipline, there might be something that you could steal. I really think a lot of art would be better. But instead we get a lot of it that's like written by sort of like the same clique in New York, who all hang out together.
And write for the New Yorker. I'll just say it. I mean, I'm so glad you said that. I love the ghosts in your novel. They're like characters. And also, yeah, and the fact that you read ghost stories for a year, I'm like, oh, and they showed up. But that's definitely something that I appreciated a lot, was how clear it was that this was a new canon. That you had created for yourself a new canon. And I really there were so many things I recognized in the book. I think that might be the heart of what connected me to it, which is that I've also reached out to create my canon, right? And like learn languages so that I can read those canons. Like studying Latin when I was 12, but then studying Sanskrit when I was 18 for 8 years, so I could read the Asian canon. And just like the Latin canon is not mine. But then I'm Buddhist, but then all that comes from India. So I gotta learn Sanskrit. And so it's like I'm Asian, but I feel like between my Chinese and my Sanskrit, I feel like I've got more of the AAPI consciousness. And I mean, so much of the Chinese Indian weave, whether alchemy came from Taoism into India, but then Buddhism came from India into China. And we have our own canon.
This was actually one of my big problems with like what to do for grad school. Is I was interested in like doing something like Asian studies, but like that doesn't exist. Everything is cordoned off. You have to do, there's basically East Asian and South Asian. and you have to have the right languages for each. So I like wasn't going to be able to go to grad school for any of them because I didn't have the language background. But when I lived in India, I became very interested in like the handful of people in Indian history who have like believed in Pan-Asianism. It's like not a common thread, but Rabindranath Tagore is one of them. He became like very interested in figuring out kind of what the common threads across the continent were, and was there a way to think about a kind of a canonical experience of Asianness, which for him was like an anti-colonial idea that like there could be a full kind of intellectual identity that you could put up against the British. But it's really, that's a minority interest in the way that we talk about that region.
Like, I love how there's a Taoist temple in here. I was like, oh my God. Like, there's like the Bombayan and the Taoist temple, and it creates this milieu of Pan-Asianism, of bringing the Chinese minor with the Bombayan minor with, and for me, that also is Silicon Valley. So let's talk about that.
Say more.
Well, one of the things we talked about yesterday, I wanted to get into more, which is how so much of the stories of the land, of the history of the land, affect contemporary consciousness, right? And so you're like, oh my God, totally. So in your research of the gold rush, in how you weave this book together between layers of history, like the past is present, the present is past, like how does that, how does a story of the land from 300 years ago still replay itself in the present?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of one of the many ideas that the book turns over and over, right? That we play out old patterns. I don't think I specifically thought of it in terms of like the land, but that's a thing that you experience kind of in California, right? Like it's just such a beautiful state. And particularly for me, like what drew me into this kind of thing that you're talking about is moving to California in my 20s and realizing that their Asian American history was American history, and that it was like central to the state's experience, which therefore actually made it central to American experience, and no one had talked about it. And so, yeah, for me, it was like fairly material. It was like walking through the Sunset and the Richmond and being like, there are 10 Asian grocery stores in these several blocks, and like no one's speaking the same languages. And like, how did this community come to be what it is? And kind of working backward from there, and just discovering that like San Francisco in particular is just like full of these, you know, there's a house that I went to one day after reading about it, where this group of revolutionary Indians like gathered to organize against the British Crown. And just you can walk into that space and be like, wow, revolutionaries lived here. I think that's something so magical about that state. And not everyone, of course, walks through the world being sort of interested in the ghosts of a city, but I've always liked that about where I live. Yeah, I like it's just it's a sort of an invisible thing that other people can go through most of their days living where they live and not having very much curiosity about what shaped the city. And I think about this a lot specifically with cities, because I think we take them for granted as like neutral spaces, when in fact there are agglomerations of stuff.
And so that brings us to the American dream. Because how you move, because I actually think when we say city, I think of how the city embodies this, um, yeah, the American dream of suburbia, Atlanta suburbia, and then the American dream that's Silicon Valley, that's the Bay Area, and how your characters or how the story that you've created, it both celebrates it and dismantles it. You know
That's
what I mean? And at the same time, I feel like even just talking to you for these 30 minutes, you're also celebrating it and dismantling it.
Yeah, if I were more radical, I would probably cut to the dismantling. But yeah, the book both believes in ambition as a productive force and also considers how that ambition can do damage, in a nutshell.
And also, I think it goes back to what we were saying, that the very thing that creates it destroys it, and that's the same with the American dream. It's like the very pursuit of it also destroys it, whereas almost the process of dismantling creates it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Definitely agree with that. Should we do
Yeah, let's open it up.
audience questions? You don't have to have a question, but
Comments, questions.
I have a question. I can kick it off. Well, first, an observation just about what you all were just talking about, and Sanjana, about what you were sharing earlier about getting into social media after the book came out. Sort of interesting. It's sort of, to me, it correlated in my brain about the lemonade itself. Like once you get a taste, you're like, oh, I need more, I need more, I need more. And like, unfortunately, that lens and like social media and like all of this like digital interactions with one another, there is now this new form of ambition and like recognition that way. So one, I just, I really admire you for taking yourself out of it. I know a lot of actors when I was living in Los Angeles growing up, and they would not watch TV for the exact same reasons that you're saying, because you have to sort of, if they were taking their craft really seriously, they had to take themselves out of what was going on and the noise and all of that. So my question is, it's interesting to me that you decided to write from the perspective of a guy, Neil, like the main character is a male. Was there a conscious decision to write him? Obviously, Anita is a big part of it too, but like, I was curious why you decided to focus on like a male protagonist.
yeah, I originally wrote from Anita's perspective, and on paper, I look a lot more like Anita. So for anyone who hasn't read it, Neil and Anita, these kind of two characters who anchor the story. Neil is this like slacker stoner underachiever, and Anita is the hyper intense overachiever, really type A, has her shit together. And I have like passed as an Anita for a lot of my life. But my inner life resembles Neil's. When I wrote from Anita's perspective, I found myself blocked. She wasn't a very interesting head to be inside because she doesn't have that much of an inner life for her teenage years, because ambition has really like flattened her. But Neil is not entirely succeeding in his world, which means he has space to have like the big thoughts and feelings that you get to have when you are not completely on the treadmill. So when I just started writing from his perspective, the voice kind of took over and I felt like I was myself. It's been interesting because I'm asked this question in almost every conversation, and I still don't have a great answer for why my like true self is a 15-year-old boy. But I do think there's also like just something about like the culture. It's like easier, I think, for women to write from men's perspective than for men to write from our perspective, because I think we kind of understand like dominant culture in a way that like people who are from a dominant perspective might not understand someone who has less power. Yeah.
Plus, it's a cool experience to, like you said, write from a completely different perspective. But I mean, Neil's hilarious, so that's really, you could tell you had fun writing it. I laughed a lot, especially in the library scenes with him and Wendy and Uncle Pranesh. So
that's really nice of you to say.
I have a couple of questions, but like you had mentioned, you've been doing these events for a couple of months, so maybe answer the one that is most interesting, or less, or not terribly uninteresting, but one is, you talked about the research process earlier, and I was actually curious about a different part of the research process, which is there's this scene where it's down in the basement and Neil is interviewing Anita's mom, and he's like, I have to be present for this. And he says something about like recording it. And that line made me think like, oh my gosh, like Sanjena gave herself such a difficult task with this novel in that there's so many different settings. There's San Francisco, there's Atlanta, there's Bombay, and not just different geographies, but different places. And in each of those places and time periods, it feels very, very present. Like you are fully there as the reader. And so I was curious about that kind of research process, how you managed to, like, obviously you've been to those places, but how did you capture that richness with such detail? So that's one question. And then the other question was kind of about what you were talking with the movie part, or not movie, the TV show part, which is, was there a plot line or character that was really, really difficult to cut from the novel? And I asked that only because you might be playing with that right now with the TV show.
Those are both great questions, and I have not been asked either of them. The first. Place is really interesting because sometimes I think it's easier to have distance from a place in order to write about it. So I wrote about Georgia while sitting in California and then in Iowa. And when I came back to Georgia, sometimes it was like the influences were too great. Like everywhere I looked, there was like a detail that I needed to grab. And I came back to Atlanta just like to see my family a couple times while I was writing. And just everything I saw, I was like, that church sign is crazy. That's got to go in. Like, I did make a dedicated trip to Dahlonega, to gold mining country. But it was really informal. Like I wanted to go on a hike there, and it was like beautiful fall weather. So I made my family go up on a hike there for like my birthday, whatever that year that was. And then I was just in the place naturally. So then I just trusted myself to remember what I needed to remember and write the scene that I needed to write in Dahlonega. And that's like such a relief coming from being a journalist, where like in order to actually, like you have to just be on all the time. And one thing that's cool about research for novels is you kind of just trust yourself to sink into it and make use of what you need. And then there are times when you like turn it up and you're like, okay, I need this specific story about history, so I'll go turn that on. But mostly it's just presence. But I did also make a couple trips back to San Francisco when I was writing. And one of them was I drove out to Marysville. I actually drove to a bunch of little gold mining towns just to see, because I didn't know what was going to happen there, but I was in the place kind of speaking of land, Jessica, and just wanted to know what came up when I was in these cities. And so I just drove for like a few hours. I think I picked a couple of different places. I wandered through their little downtowns. I thought I was looking for something pretty. And I ended up choosing this part of Marysville that is not very attractive. It's like a kind of dinky little downtown. There's that Taoist temple that Jessica mentioned, but then it's just like an industrial glimpse of a river. And that particular space stayed with me because I was like, we think of California as this romantic state. We think of the gold rush as this like big, exciting time, but there was something kind of grimy and beautiful in the grime about that space. So that was a kind of research. And then I used that one scene, and I ended up having to write stuff in those 3 blocks for like months. As for stuff that has been cut, I was telling my collaborator yesterday that I had written, so there's like a big heist in the second half of the book that takes place at an Indian bridal expo. I had originally written that heist set at the Rosewood, like the hotel. And I think you came with me, Nikki, I made you come with me to the Rosewood. I was like, we're gonna get drinks there, and I wanted to like scope it out for an imagined scene, an imagined jewelry heist. And I wrote the entire heist there, and it was not very good. But we've talked about whether or not we would like mess with more like sort of attempted crimes. Like there's a lot more to do in California. So we were like, oh, should we send them to, you know, like some rich person's house in Marin and have them try to rip off stuff from there, and then we can give it like the big little lies treatment of like the beautiful house. Like there's so much more stuff. I think particularly the stuff that's going to change the most will probably be the California stuff. So there are like a million little plot lines that we can follow there.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Also, I'm sad that that was cut, so I hope we do get to see it.
But you also have a way of like capturing place in one line. Like when you said the LA4 is an SF7, I was like, well, she just captured all of California in that one line. Like the dynamics of the two cities and
That's your move, your big move.
yeah, that's my big move. But but also like how you're able to, yes, synthesize all of that research into, yeah, I think a lot of people have mentioned like just the lushness of the prose, right? That's what we're talking about.
So what are you working on now? What's next? Now that you've cleared all the noise. I know this is probably the ultimate last question that you always get.
I'm very superstitious about work in progress. So I actually don't talk about the fiction that I'm working on, but I am working on this adaptation. So I've got 3 little screenwriting projects that are sort of like fun playtime that I've been working on in between. But now I'm like under contract for my second book. I need to like write that.
That's awesome. Congratulations.
So I don't think it's superstition. I think it's that same thing. Like one of my yoga teachers said that when the seed is being born, it needs soil, so it needs darkness. If you talk about it or you show it light, it can't grow.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, so it's not superstition, it's just gardening.
It needs darkness. That's cool.
It's just gardening. So when you're seeding a new project, it's underground. It needs dirt. It can't have light. And if you show it light, the seed will never grow. And it's not, there's something superstitious about it. It's just creative process. Like that's how we have trees.
I'm totally gonna use that.
Please use it. That's why I said it. Like I think it just needs to not be superstitious. It just needs to be like, stop asking, it's underground.
I'm underground. I'll tell everyone that from now on. They'll definitely understand.
Or you can just say I'm stealth.
Parts of SF I don't miss. That word.
Can't talk about it.
Oh, great.
Well, if you haven't read the book, for anyone who's listening in, highly, highly recommend, especially, talking about Sanjena's ability to take you to a sense of place. There is a cocktail party at a house in Alamo Square that just transports you into probably all of the house parties you've been to in those neighborhoods. And it's just a really great read. So Sanjena, thank you so much for taking the time to share. And Jessica, thank you for putting this together. We recorded this, so we'll post it and share it, and we'll make sure to follow up with a link to the book. Tell everyone, tell your friends. And then we'll look out for the show. I'm so excited to see how it adapts. Jessica, is there anything else you want to say before we tie things up, or Sanjena?
No.
I was thinking of reading it again. Oh, I did want to say one thing. This cover is unbelievable. I spent like 15 minutes just looking at the cover, and it's like, look at all of the gold jewelry, and then you have Atlanta on one corner, and then you have San Francisco in the other. And you have the lemonade in the trees, but then it intersperses with the bangles that get melted into the lemonade, and then you have the diggers. What I love about it is that it's so full of ornament, and it's so like lush, like, you know, whoever did the cover, you know, judge a book by its cover. It's an amazing cover.
Good job. I love it. But yeah, thank you. Thank you both for this. This is really cool. And next time in person.
Let's do it. Let's do it
Yeah.
at the Battery. We can all be together. We'll wear our best gold. Okay. Have a good night, everybody. Take care.
Bye.